I'm Douglas Mason, CEO of Naturally Splendid, symbol NSP on the TSX Venture Exchange. Naturally Splendid is a biotechnology and consumer products company focused on the global cannabis and health markets. Naturally Splendid is expanding distribution in this rapidly growing market with products currently in Canada, the USA, South Korea, Germany, and Australia. To view our comprehensive company presentation and for more information, please visit our website at naturallysplendid.com.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is award-winning investigative reporter Bob Mackin, the publisher of TheBreaker.News. Welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you.
As promised, BC Speaker of the House Darryl Plecas said he would release a preliminary report on the scandals surrounding the legislature, said it would knock people's socks off. How are your socks doing right now?
Oh, they're off. I had no reason to disbelieve him. Here's someone who has a long, illustrious career as an academic. He's a criminology professor with a long list of publications, papers all the way to books. He even wrote a textbook on how to do a criminal investigation. I think the problem here is that, First major problem is the system, that the Freedom of Information law does not apply to the legislature. So people like Gary Lenz, the Sergeant at Arms, and Craig James, the Speaker, those guys could spend money and do things that no cabinet minister would ever try, or at least no smart cabinet minister would ever try, because the cabinet minister would get caught. Because a smart journalist or someone from the official opposition would just file an FOI request. Well, James and Lenz existed in this weird information vacuum where they, put on their shoes every day, tied up their ties, and could be confident that they could go home and no one would know until a new speaker came in. Of course, Steve Thompson was the last Liberal speaker. He had basically a cup of coffee in the speaker's chair. Before then, that was Linda Reed. She spent 4 years. She's basically a career politician. And before that, it was Bill Barasoff, who came from the interior. He owned a trucking company, sort of a small town type of politician. They met their match in Darryl Plecas, someone who is an academic, who is used to asking questions and inquiring and doing his research and doing his homework. And boy, did he ever do his homework. That 76-page report that was released through the Legislative Assembly Management Committee on Monday in Victoria. I was there at the legislature for that. There's something on every page. I've read umpteen reports over the years of various types, but rarely has there been a report this thorough and this compact. 76 pages, but there's something on every page. I sat down to start writing my story on it, and for a moment I thought, where do I start? There's just too much here. I've been able to get several stories out so far. And this is going to have legs. As we know, there is the RCMP investigation that involves 2 special prosecutors. We found out about that November 20th when James Lenz were escorted off the property. And, police investigations, especially with 2 special prosecutors, take a life of their own, and it could take months, if not years, for something to happen on this, for there to be charges for this to get to court, but you'd have to think that there's enough damning evidence out there already that could cause the Legislative Assembly Management Committee to decide to fire both James and Lenz, who are right now suspended with pay for misconduct. Well, that's part of the several motions that were unanimously passed at the meeting in the Douglas Fir Room on Monday, on January 21st, after a lengthy in-camera session, is for the House leaders to consider the future of Mr. James and Mr. Lenz, who both actually do have until February 1st to give a response to the committee to try to justify and explain their free spending ways, and also their other ways. They spent a lot of time coming up with some interesting, clever ways of trying to get even more money. Craig James was paid almost $350,000 last year, and Gary Lenz almost $220,000, very well paid to run this operation. And they plotted over the years all sorts of ways to get extra retirement benefits. They get extra insurance benefits. They took a lot of vacation time, paid vacation time, while at the same time taking payments in lieu of vacation. And there's even one phrase in the Fleckus report that the word around the legislature was that Craig James was rarely seen in the office on Fridays. And then there's the travel. They actually had a meeting at the legislature, or where do you want to go this year meeting, to plan the next 12 months and look at the globe essentially and say, well, where do you want to go? And we'll find an excuse to make it happen. These fellows went to England quite often, to London, to the cradle of democracy. They also went to the cradle of golf. Daryl Pleckus tells a story in there about how they had a limousine and they were driving to St. Andrews while they were up in Scotland, and that James and Lenz decided that this would be the cultural learning of Scotland. Go to St. Andrews. They went to the gift shops at these various places. They went to custom tailors to get $1,000 plus suits, cufflinks, you name it, all under the guise of uniforms and work-related expenses. As I said in one of my tweets, that for Craig James, really too much was never enough. And that's the other interesting part, is that there appears to have been some discord between Gary Lenz and Craig James, and that'll be interesting to see how that factors in the RCMP investigation as well, if it factors in court, should this get to court, what that will mean, because Gary Lenz, according to Daryl Pleckus, was warning him on a number of occasions that Craig James was not someone who was trustworthy. Gary Lenz accused Craig James, according to Daryl Pleckus, of being someone who was too close to the Liberal Party. And in fact, Craig James, on one conversation with Daryl Pleckus, according to the report, told him not to worry, because he had dirt on the Liberal Party, and he could cut off some of the funds for their legal challenges. Some very interesting things that were said that Daryl Pleckus remembered, made notes about, and went on about his internal investigation to get enough information, because of suspicions that were raised in his mind that eventually were taken to the RCMP. The RCMP took it very seriously. They were the ones that asked for a special prosecutor from one of the senior bureaucrats in the Attorney General's ministry, and to their surprise, they got two. Something that really is unprecedented in BC politics. This, of course, now shifted some attention to Linda Reid, one of the assistants that was in charge of doing her expenses, was made a whistleblower complaint to the Speaker's office that something was awry there, that he was being forced to approve expenses that were not necessarily earned by Ms. Reid, who was the Speaker and is now the Assistant Deputy Speaker, and someone who is now the subject of Green Party leader Andrew Weaver's calls for her resignation from that post. And then the story that I did about looking closer at Craig James' ties, or too close for comfort, appearance with the BC Liberal Party. According to his expense claims, he came over to Vancouver and met with Christy Clark on the last day she was Premier, the day before John Horgan was sworn in. And then he met with her 3 more times, all the way until 2018. He met with Jeff Plant a lot. Jeff Plant was, he still is with the law firm that is offering legal advice to the Legislative Assembly on various human resources matters. Jeff Plant was Attorney General in Gordon Campbell's first term, and as someone who has continued to have close ties with the BC Liberal Party, most recently, Jeff Plant was the returning officer for the 2018 leadership election that resulted in Andrew Wilkinson becoming leader. There's also a very interesting meeting that was held on June 20th of last year. Jeff Plant was apparently there. It was a lunch meeting at a hotel downtown, and so was a fellow named Paul Barbeau. Why he's interesting is this. At the time, Paul Barbeau was essentially Andrew Wilkinson's right-hand man on the party side. He was the hand-picked selection by Wilkinson to the party board as the leader's representative. essentially liaison between the leader and the party. And later in 2018, Paul Barbeau actually became the president of the BC Liberal Party. He's someone who's been very active in politics, very active in civic politics with the NPA over the years. Well, this meeting that happened in June that involved Paul Barbeau and Jeff Plant, and by the way, I've tried to get both of them to comment, but haven't heard from them, and hopefully they will. But if they do, I'll update the story accordingly. Paul Barbeau and Jeff Plant met with Craig James on that day, and Craig James' expense report says the meeting was about Vancouver Point Grey. Why that's interesting is, well, Vancouver Point Grey is David Eby's riding, the NDP Attorney General, and the NDP have made some people a bit unhappy in Vancouver Point Grey with their what they call a school surtax, the tax on houses over $3 million. And that's been part of a campaign that has had help from the Liberal Party head office to organize protests and lawn signs in recent months. And so what happened at the meeting? I'd love to know from Craig James, love to know from all the other members of that meeting, Paul Barbeau and Jeff Plant, but they haven't returned my phone calls. I did on Monday night on the way to the ferry stop off at Craig James' house. He did not come to the door. His wife did. She asked me to leave. I complied. The one thing she did say was that he would be putting together a response, a formal response with legal advice, of course. And she said he's innocent. So that's what she said. And it was too bad that Mr. James didn't come to the door. He was, at the end of November, someone who did appear at a news conference along with Gary Lenz, professed their innocence, said they did no wrong, and said that they'd cooperate with the investigation. They wanted their jobs back. Well, that's what they said in November in their own voice in front of TV cameras, but we haven't seen him before TV cameras this week, and again, he didn't come to the door when I knocked on the door. Still interested in getting the other side of the story, but the story has changed tone to the point where the Legislative Assembly Management Committee is now considering, the House leaders are going to be considering whether the employment should be terminated for these two gentlemen. Again, no charges yet, nothing proven in court, but there's enough there that if this had happened in a private company, you'd think that they would have been fired long ago, but because it's in the government, in the FOI vacuum, and because those in power have turned a blind eye, or worst case scenario, maybe even been complicit in the past. All that changed when Daryl Plekas left the BC Liberal caucus to become the Speaker back in summer 2017 after it was him. He stood up and challenged Christy Clark's authority. I broke a story last week about how Christy Clark, according to Daryl Plekas, in a news release which was never published, that she wanted to replace all the non-partisan constituency office staff in the BC Liberal caucus with BC Liberal Party workers in order to undermine the NDP government. This was one of her steps to go forward to get the Liberals back into power, to basically weaken the NDP at every chance by having politicized staff in every Liberal MLA's office. Daryl Plekas didn't want that because that's not the way any MLA's office should be. MLA's offices in the community are about the people, not the party. In fact, the rules of those offices are they're not supposed to be political vehicles. Those are supposed to be for citizens and the MLAs, and nothing further than that. So here we are, just days into this, after Daryl Plekas promising this report. He delivered on his promise. Now we wait for the police investigation. Now we wait to see other shoes to drop, see what this does on the immediate horizon. There is a by-election coming up in Nanaimo, and we'll see if this impacts that result, because, again, you've got a BC Liberal Party which fell out of power after that no-confidence vote at the start of summer in 2017, and they chose a leader who was from within the party, not from someone from out of the party. And this party doesn't seem to have had enough renewal and has not reconciled its past. There's a lot of skeletons in the closet of the BC Liberal Party, that might scare people away from putting their vote or their trust in this party at this time. Well, we'll see what happens with that by-election. That'll be the first test.
Sure. Bob will talk more about the by-election in a second. What I find curious in the Plecas report is up to 17 people may have lost their jobs because they tried to point out they thought something fishy was going on with the legislative expenses. Could we see a wave of false dismissal suits come along?
Well, that's a good question there, because I noticed in the Legislative Assembly financial report for last year, they do publish a report that shows how much they pay people over $75,000 and how much they pay contractors over $25,000. There was one line item there about severances, well over $500,000 in severances. And again, this is an entity which does not employ a terrible amount of people. I mean, there are the caucus and the government, the caucus for the opposition, and there's people that operate the buildings, people in security. But this isn't a cast of thousands. It's a relatively small operation, and for it to have that kind of severance was very questionable to me. But of course, when I started asking those questions, I got no clarity whatsoever. So this is starting to come a little bit further into clarity, that maybe that big sum of money that was spent in the last fiscal year was to pay people off, basically payouts. And with payouts, sometimes when people are fired, there's non-disclosure agreements, and in order to keep them from going to court and suing. And the Legislative Assembly, I'm sure, wouldn't want to have to be battling someone for an employment wrongful dismissal case in court. So that's the question there, is those people may have signed non-disclosure agreements, and there will be legalities about that, but if this does get to criminal court, you'd have to think that a judge's order would definitely trump whatever non-disclosure agreement that they signed. The fact that you did have Jeff Plant, the former Attorney General, as a legal advisor that was involved in at least one of these human resources matters is very interesting, very intriguing. And the fact that you had someone like Craig James as the clerk running the show, someone who had made higher profile firings before, especially when he was the interim head of Elections BC back in 2010, 2011, there certainly are questions to be asked, especially when you got people that are coming out of the woodwork now saying that they were fired, not for poor performance, but for trying to do their job, that they were working in a place that was playing with taxpayers' money. These people found that the taxpayers' money was not always being spent in the right way, either by mistake or by full-on negligence, willful blindness, whatever. And the consequences they got were what they did not expect, which is not a thank you for helping save taxpayers' money, but go take a hike for trying to embarrass someone that works in the legislature. That's completely wrong. So that is another avenue here. Not only do they have the wasteful spending, unchecked spending, you not only have the insurance schemes, retirement allowances, the vacation pay schemes, but you've got the human resources matter of people who were poorly treated, potentially fired for wrong reasons, potentially fired after they actually came with the best of intentions to actually make it a better workplace. That will be another portion of this story. And again, the BC Liberals had 16 years in power. They came to power in 2001 on a platform that said they were going to be the most open, accountable government in Canada. Well, they did nothing to change the status of the legislature. It's still an FOI black hole. You've got the NDP that's been in power since July of 2017. Well, they're now in power now. They're the ones that can make change. Change doesn't usually happen very quickly in government, but there is a Legislative Assembly session coming up in February. The NDP has not made any major changes at all to the FOI law, despite promising that they would in the 2017 platform. They promised a duty to document law. Well, now's their chance to do something. Now's their chance to do something to bring the legislature into the 21st century and put it into the FOI Act, because it's rather unfair that you've got deputy ministers and executive directors and other people all the way down the chain in government ministries who rightfully are governed every day by the FOI law, and they have that checks and balance hanging over their head. And that is an anti-corruption measure that prevents people from spending too much or spending the wrong way or sticking money in their pockets. Well, you've got people like Craig James and Gary Lenz. No matter what the outcome of the RCMP investigation is, you do have proof here that they were using money in a fashion that was most unwise, and that is being most diplomatic.
We'll have more with Bob Mackin, and we'll be talking about the Nanaimo by-election right after this.
I'm Greg Johnston, CEO of Carl Data Solutions, an industrial Internet of Things company that provides big data solutions for monitoring critical infrastructure. Carl Data offers machine learning and predictive analytics features through our cloud-based applications to deliver key asset-saving operational insights from massive amounts of data. Carl Data trades on the CSE symbol CRL and the pink symbol CDTAF. For more details on Carl Data, please visit carlsolutions.com.
Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications, patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bob Mackin. Bob, the Nanaimo by-election is next Wednesday. Who are the major players, and what do the polls tell us about the battle?
Well, we've got Tony Harris for the Liberals, who's really running on his father's reputation, even though he is a businessman who's in real estate. He's also in car dealers and various other investments. Tom Harris was his father, a prominent local businessman who was a car dealer and early cell phone dealer. He's running for the Liberals, noticing that the Liberal election campaign signs try to downplay the Liberal Party and try to play up. Tony Harris for Nanaimo. That's an interesting strategy, especially since it's been just less than a year since the leadership campaign where Andrew Wilkinson won. You'd think that this would be a chance for them to, at least in one key riding, on Vancouver Island to try to get Andrew Wilkinson's name out there, but for some reason they must have done some polling and figured out that it may be a bit of a liability, that downplay the Liberal brand. You're probably not going to get many swing voters. They're going to have to rely on traditional Liberal voters. What they are relying on also is a lot of people coming in from other parts of the province to work on this campaign. There isn't much of a Liberal infrastructure in Nanaimo. It's traditionally an NDP stronghold. This by-election was mandated because Leonard Krogh quit as being a backbench MLA to become mayor of Nanaimo. And so you've got this race, which also includes Sheila Malcolmson. The NDP got perhaps the strongest candidate they could in Sheila Malcolmson, who was the sitting member of parliament, sitting NDP federal member of parliament, who wants to go provincial. And you'd have to think that if she can pull this out and win this by-election, that she'd be perhaps cabinet material. Then you've got Michelle Ney, who's the daughter of Frank Ney, the famous mayor of Nanaimo, who was a social credit MLA himself for a period of time, who also was the biggest ambassador for Nanaimo and also the mascot for the annual bathtub race. He always dressed up as a pirate, went sailing in the world's biggest bathtub. He's quite a legend, living legend, or not living anymore, but his legacy lives on. And last year was the centennial of his birth. So the name Ney for people who lived in Nanaimo for many years is something that might resonate. She's running for the Green Party, and it's possible that you could see a similar dynamic to what happened in the 2017 provincial election, where those who may not want to vote NDP park their votes in the Greens instead of parking their votes in the BC Liberals because, well, they can't trust the BC Liberals like they used to. You do have Justin Greenwood running for the BC Conservatives. even though he lives and works on the mainland, he's someone who has a background in Vancouver Island, in the hub city. There's also the worry among Liberals that the Conservatives could split the vote. So this is in no way a given for the BC Liberals to do what is traditionally done, which is beat the government in a by-election, because by-elections often are a bit of a referendum on the sitting government. But you do also have a situation where the BC Liberal opposition really hasn't found its feet per se, except on a few issues where they have been able to get some support. There's people who do own expensive houses, or people who do own second houses, that are not terribly happy with the new taxes the NDP is collecting, and the way that they're collecting it. So there is that undercurrent of distrust in the NDP, but this might just go down to getting the vote out. Whichever side gets the vote out will win. And the NDP, again, has what the Liberals really don't have in Nanaimo, which is a machine. Nanaimo is a very labor-friendly city, a city that does have a tradition of voting NDP. And if those voters can be coaxed out on the same day, they would probably outnumber the Liberal voters. And especially now that we've got the situation of the Legislature scandal, which really, that is something that's worn mostly by the BC Liberals, because they were the ones that actually hired Craig James in a controversial fashion in 2011. There was no competition for his job. They went into the Legislature. They didn't go to the Legislative Assembly Management Committee. They just went into the Legislature, and the Liberal caucus outvoted the NDP caucus to appoint Craig James as the new clerk of the House back in 2011. So this is something on their shoulders. This is something also, there was previous reports by the Auditor General that warned that the Legislature was not managed well at all, and was too secretive, and was wasting money. That was on Craig James' shoulders at the time too. Well, you've got a situation now where the NDP and the Greens can use this as a stick against the BC Liberals, that how can they sell themselves to the voters like they often do as being superior financial managers, when the person that they hired to manage the day-to-day affairs of the legislative building itself was someone who, it turns out, was not doing a good job on behalf of the people. He was enjoying the high life and enjoying the fact that it was an FOI-free zone. So we'll see what the polls do say. I haven't seen a poll that's necessarily fully credible yet. I mean, there was the poll by Main Street out of Ontario, but I saw what they did during the Vancouver election, and it's a company that still hasn't quite resolved its problems from the Calgary election from the year previous. The polling was a little bit disorganized from my standpoint, especially when in one poll they included the name of a baby of a Vision Vancouver supporter, and the poll that they did closer to election day was never published. So I'm not going to put too much stock in what Main Street's doing. They're a company out of Ontario. I'm waiting to see if there's any BC-based polling companies that might venture in and get some numbers and some stats and facts. And there was a poll also done for a publication called the Orca, but that was a poll done by an Eastern company which has close connections to the Conservative Party. Waiting to see something that's maybe a little more BC based, BC centric kind of polling company, to see if they have any insight. But again, polling in elections, it's always an adventure.
We'll have more with Bob Mackin right after this.
Cypress Development Corp's flagship lithium project is located just east of Albemarle's Silver Peak mine in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. A 12-hole exploration drill program for lithium-enriched claystone on Cypress's 100% controlled properties is now underway. Cypress Development Corp trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the Pink's CYDVF, and on Frankfurt's C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bob Mackin. Bob, an interesting headline in The Breaker. China surprised by Canada's resistance. Is that talking about the Huawei executive being held for possible extradition to the U.S.?
Indeed, I interviewed Peter Dahlin, who's a human rights activist in Sweden who's done a lot of work in China, and some of the work he did in China got him in trouble with the Chinese government, which doesn't like people questioning authority, and will make up very large charges and arrest them and throw them in jail. Well, that was the subject of the Breaker.News podcast for this week. I caught up with Peter Dahlin via Skype. He's in Madrid. And he told me about his experience. He spent a little over 3 weeks in Chinese jail back in 2016, about, the hours and hours and hours every day of interrogation, the poor conditions, and essentially he said he was more or less disappeared than detained. He says the Chinese authorities employ kind of a different way of jailing people, that they'll move them around to different locations. They'll not only interrogate them, but isolate them from their lawyers, their family, consulates. Their staff only get to visit, monthly basis. It's not a condition that really is supposed to be, internationally approved by the United Nations. This is rather draconian, and it's unfortunate the United Nations is so toothless it can't coax China into adopting ways and means to treat prisoners in a humane fashion. He basically said that looking at the situation where we do have a couple of high-profile people arrested, physicist Michael Spavor and diplomat Michael Kovrig, who were arrested as retaliation for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou at Vancouver International Airport. We've seen also Robert Schellenberg, a British Columbian who was convicted of drug smuggling in China. He was jailed for 15 years, but then the Chinese court reconvened and changed the sentence to death sentence, and they've rejected Canada's pleas for clemency. So he adds this all up and says that China is surprised that Canada's resisting, because China keeps upping the ante, and Canada keeps trying to find ways of resisting China, and we're a small player in the world, population-wise, when it comes to comparing us to China. We've got a large economy, and our trade with China might be what ultimately resolves this, perhaps, is because we've got resources that China needs. They can complain all they want about the arrest of Meng Wanzhou on behalf of the United States, which wants to extradite her and try her on charges of fraud. They can complain all they want about that, but at the end of the day, we've got resources that they need in China, and trade needs to happen. The end of the month is coming pretty quickly, and there is a deadline for the United States to submit its extradition case, and according to media reports, that will happen. The United States is preparing that case, and we'll file it, and we'll see what other surprises that China has for Canada along the way. That case will need to be heard first by the federal justice minister, who doesn't very often reject extradition submissions, but could reject it. But if the case is strong enough, there's no reason to see it rejected, and to allow the courts to deal with this. There is a February 6th court date already scheduled for Meng Wanzhou to fix the date for the extradition proceedings. And again, she does live rather comfortably in Dunbar, while a mansion that her husband has in his name is being readied from renovators' sake to possibly be their next home. They could move there from Dunbar and live during the months and perhaps years while the courts deal with the extradition. That's assuming, of course, everything does go right with the U.S. case, the justice minister, and then gets filed appropriately in court and the proceedings begin. But we'll see where this goes. We've seen some interesting other overtures. Ren Zhengfei, who is Meng Wanzhou's father, has done some media interviews. He's the founder of Huawei. I found that very interesting that he's done some interviews, a bit of a charm offensive. He even had complimentary words for the for Canadian authorities for treating his daughter well while she was in jail, which is interesting because that kind of contravenes what the Chinese government was saying while she was in jail, complaining that her human rights were being violated and she was subject to awful conditions. Well, that was wrong. Her father even says so. So you've got that happening, and you do also have John McCallum, the Canadian ambassador to China, who has been visiting Canada for meetings. He is a former Liberal politician himself, who even said some interesting words to Chinese language media that Meng Wanzhou could put together a reasonable case to battle her extradition. And it was almost like he was telegraphing hints for her on what to say, or have her lawyer what to say, but also explaining to the public that this is an independent court here we have in Canada. It's by the rule of law, not the rule by law, and it'll be up to both sides to make their arguments and convince the judge that it should go to the next step, that she should be extradited. But again, this could go to the Court of Appeal, go to the Supreme Court. After it's all said and done, it could be a long time and a lot of money spent before her status is actually defined, whether she gets to go back to China, or if she is sent down to the United States to face these serious criminal charges, which could send her to jail for a couple or 3 decades.
Well, from extradition hearings I've covered, a person can't be sent to a country for a law that doesn't exist in Canada. Right now, Canada doesn't have a law prohibiting trade with Iran. So how would this work?
Well, Canada is allowed to create laws similar to United States laws for trade embargoes, but the case as it was presented during the bail hearings, even though it was about doing business legally between for Huawei to be doing business legally with Iran through a dummy company called Skycom, the issue actually was fraud, and Canada has fraud on the criminal code as the United States does as well. So
exactly, yes.
The issue of doing trade with Iran is important. But that's where laws were broken. But the law that was broken was the United States alleges was fraud, in which Huawei went to banks, including HSBC, and told them about their arrangements with Skycom, and claimed that Skycom was a subsidiary, when in fact, or it was its own company, when in fact Skycom was a shell company, a dummy company, a company that U.S. authorities said was set up for the purpose of deceiving and for the purpose of subverting the trade embargo. So, this really is at its heart a fraud case.
Also, when you said the Chinese surprised at Canada's resistance, maybe they don't know our history. They don't know about Vimy Ridge. In World War II, we had over 1 million people in uniform, over 1/10 of the population. No other country had that. They've never played hockey against us. And we live in the coldest nation on earth. Canadians are gotta be pretty tough.
Well, Canadians are hardy, and
we're friendly, but tough.
I think the Chinese, of course, one of their lionized figures is Dr. Norman Bethune, who came and treated Chairman Mao during the Revolutionary War. Well, children are taught about Dr. Bethune in schools. That's part of the curriculum, and there's statues of Bethune in China. And in recent years, a lot of Chinese government officials have gone around the world to study, and some of them have come to Canada, Canadian universities to study. They can't be that ignorant of Canadian history. Maybe they don't know all about Canada being as hardy as we know we are, and we know this country is. But I think that they're also trying to play for their own audience. This is a country, 1.3 billion people, that is still not a democracy, of course. It's got a draconian human rights record, and it's a police state, surveillance state. It's a propaganda state. and the Chinese government loves to play on these us and them disputes and to stoke sometimes out of control patriotism. We've seen the flare-ups in recent years between China and Japan over historical disputes going back to the World Wars. The Japanese did treat China terribly historically, and China has sometimes exploited that. Of course, there's the long-running saga with Taiwan that China claims Taiwan is just a rebel province, and every once in a while disputes flare up over that. We've seen the Chinese military mobilize in the Pacific in recent years. Again, this is a country that does know how to play with its propaganda machine, and a country that has its strongest leader since Mao. Xi Jinping is coming up on 1 year since they announced that he would be the president, essentially the president for life, that his term limits were abolished last year. So you got that interesting geopolitical dynamic where you've got Meng Wanzhou wanted in the United States, where Donald Trump is the president, and he's beyond the halfway point of his first term, and there's questions if he'll make it to the end of his first term unless he's impeached. Robert Mueller might have Donald Trump's future in his hands, and if Donald Trump is able to get by that and win another election in 2020, well, he'd be president until 2024. 2024, Xi Jinping could be halfway through his presidency with still no end in sight. A lot of people look at the United States, it's still the number one economy, but the Chinese economy is gaining pretty fast. You do have a leader in the United States who has been widely criticized for his style, but in some schools of thought, the most powerful man in the world now is Xi Jinping. We should be paying a lot more attention to what's happening in China, his policies, and how companies like Huawei play into the strategy for China to dominate the world. They want to become a superpower. They want to be a country that peacefully spreads. Around the world, they're already pushing their Belt and Road massive infrastructure initiative in Africa, Europe, and Asia. They've got a large diaspora around the world. A lot of mainland Chinese have moved elsewhere in the world in recent years and have made very large investments. We can't underestimate China in its role and its impact on our way of life here in Canada, especially when we are trading partners, but we're not allies. They don't share our sense of freedom and our constitution or rule of law. So it's going to be an interesting year ahead in 2019 as we watch not only this dispute play out in Vancouver with Meng Wanzhou and whether she gets extradited to the U.S., but just the geopolitical atmosphere and relationship between Canada and China. And we'll see if this also feeds into the 2019 federal election. I always look back at the 2015 federal election. There was an international international foreign policy and affairs debate that the leaders held. Well, guess what was not on the agenda? They didn't talk about China. And I thought to myself, when that happened in 2015, did they have their blinkers on? Didn't they know what was happening in the world, especially on the West Coast? Well, here we are in 2019, and China is one of the major stories that all of us in our communities here in British Columbia have to take a keen interest in.
Bob, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you.
My guest has been investigative reporter Bob Mackin, publisher of thebreaker.news. If you have any questions for Bob or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet, our YouTube channel, Talk Digital Network. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of Howe Street Media Incorporated.